with you all today. I've been in your house many times, but not in your pulpit. So thank you. Just to let you all know, I went to a UCC seminary, the Bangor Theological Seminary in Maine, and it is truly a joy to get my God on this morning. So scripture message makes me think of times that we have been tested regarding who are we going to join? Who are we going to believe? What are we going to believe in? Which group are we going to pledge our allegiance to? The Israelites followed Moses and took on belief in this new God called the Lord, but when there was trouble, they complained. Doesn't sound like any of us, right? And they needed proof that their path was the right one. The people led by Moses were having what we might call serious issues as they were forming their new religious community. And the problems they had then are still basic human problems today. How do we go from being a part of a group to being on our own to maybe joining a new group? How do we change our course? How do we decide that becoming one of them is a good thing? One of them, the very type of person that we might not even like. For the Israelites, it meant a new way of living, a new religion, a new home. Any of us might have those same feelings of anxiety when we try something new, when we have invested our time, our talent, our treasure, and then we've hit obstacles, like for them first. Sometimes these tests move us to find new faith or a new way of doing things. Faith has ways of changing our hearts, and often this change that we recognize was there already, but we needed to recognize it. Have you ever had an instance in your life where you told somebody something and they went, we already knew that? Where people can see something about you before you have been able to recognize it? Well, the Israelites needed proof that their path was the right one so that they could recognize the change that had already happened in their hearts. They had already decided to follow Moses in their hearts, but they needed to know it was right. Well, I don't have a story of water coming from a rock or from bricks or manna from heaven, but I do have a story of recognizing a change that had already happened. A few weeks ago, my husband Kevin and I went to a celebration in South Bend. If he was here, he'd be a wonderful illustration of what I'm talking about. He's about 6'1" and very loud. See, for weeks we had worked on the defeat of HJR3, because we are allies for people who are LGBTQ. The good folks from Freedom, Indiana had a potluck gathering in South Bend for everyone to meet and greet and eat and debrief. Now, many gay and lesbian people and their allies had met during the process, and this was an opportunity to talk about what it was like to keep the community together and also to keep us informed of further events. Not just of future legislative activities, but of fun ones too, because a community had been born. We had a great time, and when we left, Kevin, my usually super talkative husband, was very quiet. On the way home, I wanted to talk about it. I had to get it out of him. This is unusual. He first pointed out how funny it was to be so much older than the vast majority of the people there. Well, I guess I had noticed that I was old enough to be the mother of about 90% of the folks there. But it was no big deal to me. His real issue, though, was how astounding it felt to be welcomed into this group whose individual members are so different from him. Not just younger, but different. Building community is hard, and you don't always recognize yourself as a part, which happened in our case in South Bend. The differences seemed larger than the similarities. It was amazing to see this big group of young people. There were like 100 folks at this house. So energized over issues of social justice. We had met a few of these young people, but there they were in this large group. Light, well-spoken, articulate, fearless. These young adults and a handful of teenagers blew us away. As Kevin and I talked, the larger truth emerged. He marveled at their enthusiasm, and he wished for their ongoing safety, but he kept saying, they. And pointed out, they are our people. They weren't nice to him only because they respect their elders. They weren't nice to him only because they're kind to strangers. He is one of them. I am one of them. We are in us. We are not in us and them. By his participation in our phone banking, he was not comfortable making the phone calls. By bringing us food and doing the tech help needed, by my opening up the church for the phone banking, we could become allies first, and then we could become part of the family. Eventually, we had become one of them. And looking at these kids who are working for a healthier, happier adulthood for themselves than what Indiana currently provides, they're in our hearts forever, making us all one. That conversation that night never left my consciousness. Think of the time you've looked at a group, maybe with trepidation or even discomfort, only to find yourself sometime later realizing you've become one of them. You know, my gray hair has put me into a category I didn't used to know about. It's okay. The sense of belonging is an important human emotion, and one we seek, consciously or not. The Israelites sought new community. The kids from South Bend sought new community, all trying to make better lives for themselves, all forming new communities, overcoming that feeling of us and them. I remembered another time when I saw life as us and them in Maine, where I went to school. I served as the director of religious education, and that church hosted a women's singing group comprised of women from that church and beyond. I used to look upon that group of women as less than desirable. I knew they were harmless and not to be feared, but I did not wish to associate with them either. Certainly, I had nothing in common with them besides gender. I mean, really, they dressed in these flowy hippie clothes, even though it was the 1990s, and they sang about weird stuff like power and goddesses. They were harmless, but they weren't my cup of tea. Over the next year, I had met many of the individual members as they participated in other areas of church life, and I felt the thaw begin. Then, as I was in the building to do my religious ed work, sometimes on Thursday nights, when they met to sing, I heard the songs. And they were songs of freedom. And they were kind of catchy. When I found myself humming one of the tunes to myself when I was alone in my car, well, that freaked me out. I had to face my fear, so I attended one of the meetings, just to get it out of my system. I kept going back. 2 years later, when I left Maine, they were one of the groups I missed the most, and I still do. My assimilation had been very slow, but very complete. I had become one of them, for which I am grateful. What I found, as I got to know the individuals, is that many of those women had fought the battles, which makes it possible for women of my generation to have happier, healthier lives. So maybe add that list of hippie women to the list of Israelites, to the list of kids from South Bend. Maybe lift up those mature women who speak and sing their truth. We are them, and they are us. That moment you realize, maybe even to your dismay, that you belong can be gradual or immediate. We all like to think that we have everything we need. Of course, it's important to be self-sufficient, to find one's confidence, but it is community and peer groups that give us the tools we need. We need each other to survive. The HJR3 people know it. The women's singing group knows it. And if you think about it, you know it. In your quest for something bigger, which came first? Faith in God or belonging to a community? Think of walking into this church. Was it years ago? Was it last month? First, your head has to make sense of what it experiences as you intellectually weigh qualities like, are the pews comfortable? Are you satisfied with the service? Is it easy to get to on Sunday morning? Then, when your intellectual needs are met, you zero in on the message. This group's friendliness, the theologies that are here, and the ones which are absent. What is it that you're not hearing that you're so grateful for? Soon, your heart took over, because when your head has assured you of safety, then your heart leaves you vulnerable. And then you can belong. And really, what we are talking about, what the Israelites were complaining about, what Moses was led to show them, is vulnerability. The Israelites were feeling vulnerable. They were worried they had left everything for a wrong path. They said, "Why did you bring us out of Egypt to make us and our children and livestock die of thirst?" They felt vulnerable. And this new religion was scary to them. Even as it seemed right, it was still scary. I remember looking at different churches, deciding if any of them felt right for me. Did any of you do that? Are all of you Cradle UCC? Have you had the stability of growing up in this faith? Most Americans are not in the same church or religion for their whole lives. My morning proposition is that we actually don't fear that which is strange to us. We fear that which is just similar enough to be recognizable. The biggest fights between churches are not between, say, Islam and Catholicism. It's likely between two similar groups. Because really, we're not likely to jump from Islam to Catholicism or the other way, but we might go from, say, Presbyterian to UCC, and y'all are thinking, that's really different. Or UCC and UU, those are really different. I'm here to tell you, we're all people. Joining said group could cause personal growth. And we fear growth, we people. It feels like change, and we hate change. Can I get an amen? Vulnerability leads us to change. Change leads us to growth. And growth has the potential, well, to change our very identity. We could find ourselves becoming one of them. We could find ourselves following Moses. We could find ourselves in a women's singing group. Did any of you imagine that we'd be in a pew on Sunday morning? We could find ourselves advocating for gay rights. Our hearts, our faith might change. I have one last illustration for this morning. It's from a movie. Have you all seen Gran Torino with Clint Eastwood? He's a fairly racist guy. He begrudgingly gets to know his Vietnamese neighbors. His own family, his grown son, and that family, do not have the main character's respect. He sees them as spoiled. Over time, he watches his Vietnamese neighbors, and he gets to appreciate their strong family values and their sense of community. His Vietnamese neighbors see him as one of them. He's a man in their neighborhood. There's a scene where he realizes they have changed him. They've shown him love and respect, and he has a moment of crisis when he realizes he cares about them. He looks in the mirror and speaks aloud to himself that he has more in common with his Hmong neighbors than with his own family. Of course, that message relates to church life, and to community, to that moment when you heard yourself say, "my church," instead of "the church." In my case, I grew up unchurched, and after months of saying, I sometimes attend the UU church, it just fell out of my mouth one day. I am a Unitarian Universalist. Have any of you all ever had the experience of having to claim, I am a Christian, and hear yourself say it? Instead of, I attend a UCC church, I am a Christian. Attendance had led, in my case, to belonging, which led to change. I had gone from being an unchurched person to having church friends and a church life. Of course, after that, I felt a call to ministry and everything went downhill. I had become one of them. It was risky, and I've never regretted it. How about your journey to this place? In each of our stories of becoming vulnerable, the risk is high, and it's worth it. When you find yourself calling this place your church, when you realize that you have found God, when you realize they or we are not the other, but that we are all one, you recognize that you belong. You probably belonged for some time, but you needed to recognize it. The Israelites had been on the right path all along, but they needed for that water to spring forth before they could truly understand themselves to be the Lord's people. What stories of transformation could you share from your faith, or movies, from church attendance? What stories of transformation could you share from your life? A time when you realize that really there's no otherness about that person. You are them. They are you. Be brave enough to see yourself in someone else's struggle. Go ahead and wear those flowy hippie clothes out in public. Be brave enough to see yourself in the eyes of someone whose race or sexual orientation is different from yours. Be brave enough for their stories to reflect in yours. We